Welcome to Accelerate DFX. This is our first in a series of 4 sessions that we'll be holding over the next 3 Wednesdays and today. I want to thank, obviously, the City of Kitchener. They were gracious enough to give us this room to run these sessions out of. I want to thank all our panelists, which you'll be introduced to in a second, as well as Andre Hladio from Intellijoint. The idea behind these sessions were that when we first started up 44 Gawker, which is the AC's new hardware innovation lab, we realized that we weren't doing a good enough job of supporting hardware and product and physical item companies in the region as a whole. So we talked to some of our former grads about their experiences with building product, and they said the common theme was that they weren't given enough information about what it was actually like to take the designs and the ideas that they had for a product and turn it into something real. And the way Curtis McBride, who is a big supporter of this idea, described it as he screwed up a lot of relationships trying to get his stuff made, and that if he could give just a couple of ideas to fix other people's mistakes before they happen, this would be a great success. So that's where the idea of this came from. So we decided to do this. I'm going to give a couple of housekeeping things. So for emergency procedures, fire, tornado, big gorilla. Our exit is out that way towards Duke Street, and hilariously enough, the washrooms are also out that way, so if you need to run out that way before the emergency procedures for bathrooms, you can find the bathrooms out in that direction. And that's about it. So I'm going to hand it over to Andre, who is the CTO and co-founder of Intellijoint, and he's going to give sort of a war story of like the types of things that through his experiences, he found important when designing for test, safety, and compliance. And so without further ado, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much, David.
All right, thanks, guys.
Can everyone hear me okay? I don't know whether I love or hate this thing. So yeah, when David asked, well, he initially asked Armin to give this talk. Armin's in Australia right now, so he can't be here, so I get the pleasure of being with you today. And it really is an honor to be here today. We were in your shoes probably about between 5 and 7 years ago, where we were initially developing our product. So Intellijoint Hip, we make a product for hip replacement surgery that helps orthopedic surgeons align hip implants precisely in the operating room. So right now, surgeons are aligning things by eye, they're kind of checking things, feeling the tension of the muscles, and then calling it good on the patient's implants. So when we started our company, we thought, you know, there should be a better way to do this. There should be a way where we can actually get measurements to surgeons in the operating room to help them do a better job. And that's the reason we started Intellijoint. So when we started the company, we moved into the accelerator center shortly thereafter, and we didn't have a space to develop our solution is a hardware solution. So it has surgical instruments, a computer, software running. So it's a complex medical device. And we didn't have an appropriate space to do that, but we managed at the Accelerator Center. We didn't let the administration know some of the things we were doing, and everyone got along just fine. So we were able to commercialize our first gen product out of the Accelerator Center. So just a bit more background about that and about our company. So we developed a first gen product, and that product we used in a limited number of surgeries. And the reason for doing that was so that we can get our product in the hands of users, which is where my understanding is where a lot of you are today, where you need to get your product into the hands of users so that they can evaluate it, so that you can learn what you need to tweak and adjust to get your product ready for prime time, ready for a full commercial launch. So that's what we did, and we made some deliberate choices when we were designing the product, including choices with regards to designing for test, safety, and compliance with that first generation product to get it into the hands of users faster. So once we did that, we learned from the product, we went back to the drawing board, and we developed our second generation product, which is what we're using commercially today. So for about the past year and a half, we've been using our product commercially. We've been starting to build out the commercial side of our company now that the product has been developed. So Right now, it's a lot of fun because we're out in the field, we're selling it to hospitals, we're talking with surgeons, we're getting our device used in different geographies, we're growing the number of surgeries we're doing. Today, there's probably 10 surgeries being done with Intellijoint throughout the world. So it's a really rewarding feeling, but you need to have a product to get to this point. And in order to have a product, you need to address design for test, safety, and compliance. So when I was asked to do this talk, I didn't realize, how many people would be here. This setting is very formal and almost intimidating. We have some real experts here on the panel who know much more than I do about design for test, safety, and compliance. So it is a bit intimidating for me. But my main goal here for today is for you to walk away with at least something that's useful. And so I would like to keep this as informal as possible. So if anyone has any questions, just shoot your hand up or yell from the audience. That would be great. And I think the same goes for the panel too. If there's anything you want to call me out on or you might disagree with or any further questions or clarifications, let me know. Because again, you guys are all leaders, you're all busy, you have a million things to do and you're here right now. So we need to make the most of this, make the most of your time here. So given that, one other thing I'll share with you before I jump in is when I was asked to do this, Intellijoint Surgical is a medical device company. There was never any doubt that we're a medical device company. And the first thing people know about medical device companies is you have to go through a whole bunch of regulatory and compliance hurdles. And so when David asked me to kind of come up here and share war stories, I was thinking about it and I was kind of feeling bad because we don't have any kind of colossal, epic war stories to share with you. I definitely have a few kind of more minor anecdotes, but the reason is that we came into this knowing we had to address kind of the regulatory compliance testing hurdles. Some of you may not be in that same boat, but you're here today, which I think is fantastic. So in some ways, I may not be the best person to be giving this talk because I don't have those epic war stories to share. But anyway, I did want to ask the audience actually and get a sense for what industries are represented here. So I will ask that question to the audience. Can people just shoot up their hands? What industries are you in? Okay, IoT? Energy? Pharma, okay.
Pet tech.
What? Pet tech? Can you define that?
Things for technology for your dogs and cats.
Okay, interesting. I'm sure that has interesting implications for compliance. Election management? Election management software. Oh, that's cool. All right. Clean tech. Banking. Okay, great. All right, good. We have at least one medical device. Healthcare. Okay, great. And is it fair to assume that most people are basically within their first-gen product development here? Has anyone developed a first-gen product that they've got out to users? One. Okay, two. So you guys are in a minority here. And most people are trying to develop their first-gen product and get it into the hands of users, and that's why you're here. Is that fair? Okay, most people are nodding. Okay, great. And out of the group that's here, just out of curiosity, how many people are engineers? Okay, and how many people are founders of your respective companies? Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, yeah, congratulations, and thanks again for being here today. So before I dive in, I'm actually glad that we have a diverse industries represented here because what I'm going to discuss today, I think, is I'm going to try not to focus too much on the specifics of what worked for us. I'm going to draw on my personal experience on the specifics that worked for us, but then try to deliver something that's a little bit more abstract and hopefully useful to you, whether you're in clean tech or you're in pet tech. And I'm also going to try not to have it be too vague so that it's not useful. So again, please jump in if there's any further clarification that could be added. So I'll turn to my slide. I'm trying out a one-slide presentation here. And I'll start with demystify it. So when we're talking about design for test, safety, and compliance, obviously if you look on the right-hand side there, there's a million different logos of different test labs and regulatory bodies. And when you look at that, that can be intimidating, it could be daunting. And for us, what really worked is looking at our needs and demystifying the whole design for test, safety, and compliance. So having someone in-house who owns it and who seeks to understand it to the extent that is necessary. And your goal really is to get your product out there into the hands of users. So whoever is trying to understand this internally, preferably somebody on your leadership team, which is what we did, will understand, they'll know what they need to know and demystify this whole process. The next point there is postpone it. So, as I alluded to in our case, we developed a first-gen product which was critical for our second-gen product success. And for the first-gen product, we made a lot of decisions where we postponed lots of stuff. So we wanted a custom PCB. We bought an off-the-shelf general-purpose board for the first-gen product. We wanted to go to more of a tooled enclosure for our product. We went with a machined enclosure. We ultimately want global certification so that we can sell globally. We decided that we would stick with essentially the lightest possible certification that would get us through FDA. And so that was the approach we took. It allowed us to get the product into the hands of users faster, and it allowed us then to have the flexibility when we developed our second-gen product to then commit, once the dust had settled, to commit to a more extensive certification. So that's something I would highly recommend to everyone. It works in concert with the first point of demystifying it. You need to demystify it. You need to understand what you need. You need to know what you need to know, and then you need to, based on that, know what you can postpone. And you want to postpone as much as you can. Sometimes even when things sound simple, they're not simple, so you want to push it off. Know your audience. So ultimately, when you do design for test, safety, and compliance, one caveat here is that obviously all of us want to design products that are safe, and we obviously all want to thoroughly test our products, but I'm speaking about this more in terms of like the certification type of design for test, safety, and compliance. When you do that, ultimately you're generating document artifacts, you're generating records. That's the output of your design for test, safety, and compliance. So for example, if you need to pass a test, there needs to be a record of you passing that test, and it needs to be filed away, generally in a quality management system, which would need to, you as early stage companies will need to start putting in place, presumably. Nonetheless, you have these document artifacts, and someone is going to look at them. And so one thing that served us really well is to keep in mind who's looking at those documents. Why are they looking at those documents? How are they going through the documents? So for example, in medical devices, you have your design requirements, and then you have you're mandated to do a risk analysis, so you have risks that trace to your design requirements, that then trace to your test protocols, that then trace to the actual test results. And so in our case, a reviewer of the documents might not sit down with your risk report and read it like a novel from beginning to end. What they might do is open it up to a random page, select a risk, and then trace it through to the design requirements document, and then trace that through to the test protocol, and then trace that through to the test report. So the reviewers look at documents differently. They have different approaches when looking at documents. So whenever you're doing this, just keep in mind who's looking at your documents and why are they looking at it. One example for us is for those who are developing medical devices, you might know that in the United States, the FDA approves medical devices based on this idea of substantial equivalence, which means your device is the same as another device, so the FDA gives you your approval. Now, the crazy thing about that is how is anyone supposed to develop anything innovative when your criteria for market access is to be the same? So so any innovation going through the FDA is actually a big challenge. And we knew that. When we were designing our device, the predecessor devices in our field were highly accurate, but highly cumbersome, and no one adopted them. So what we thought is, you know what, this level of accuracy is not needed for orthopedic surgery. They just need something better than eyeballing. So we're going to tune down the accuracy knob, and we're going to tune up the speed knob, the speed of use. And we thought that's something surgeons would want. But getting through the FDA would have been a challenge, because our device wouldn't have been viewed as accurate as the previous device. So then our approval was jeopardized because of that. So what we did is we knew what the reviewers would be looking for, and we knew that outside of our specific space, but still within orthopedics, there was another class of devices which are kind of purely mechanical in nature, like think of them as like surgical rulers. And we knew of this class of device. So we anticipated the FDA getting back to us saying, no, you're not as accurate. And we said, okay, but you've already blessed this class of device here, and we're essentially borrowing that aspect. Our novel feature is actually present in this class of devices here, which you've already approved. So they were basically forced to give us approval. So that was our way of getting something innovative through the FDA. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that knowing your audience, knowing when you're submitting your documentation, who's going to be reading it, what are they going to be looking for. So I'll actually pause there because I'm just wondering if there are any questions up until this point in time, or comments, or. So we did Health Canada first because for our device classification, Health Canada is basically almost a checkbox. You almost get it for free. And FDA is more of a hands-on review. So that's what we did. Alexa.
Yeah, for identifying like that, you were saying you felt like you know the last your technology that was present in a different technology.
Yep.
Did you initially find that as part of like your IP strategy, or did you initially find that as part of like patents or your strategy?
So we initially found that just because we were spending a lot of time in the operating room and just observing what surgeons were doing today. And so it was kind of, is more of a product design thing there, where we tried to borrow something that was already familiar to surgeons. But I do think, everyone here, I know you guys are all leaders in your companies, and you probably are aware of the patent landscape, and that is a great place to kind of mine for different ideas. Okay. The next one was make relationships. Yes. So this one is also something that we've invested in a lot, and we find that it really helps. I mean, anytime you need to get anything done, making relationships is obviously a good idea. But when you're at when we were in your stage, we couldn't care less really about relationships. We wanted the approvals. We wanted the clearance. But then you realize that after you get your clearance, you're going to be redesigning your product and needing to get another approval or another clearance. So having people within who are external, who are reviewers or auditors, make relationships with those people, foster those relationships. Just be normal, nice, polite people to them, treat them like humans, and we found that really goes a long way. I need to be careful what I say with this one because we have some test lab representation on the panel. But I'm assured that TUV is I was actually very pleased to hear that TUV takes a very hands-on kind of people approach with testing. But one of the things that we found is that across, a lot of test labs are massive companies. They're kind of these global entities who are very process-driven, very process heavy. And so one example was in our current generation of the product, we had to go with a bigger test lab because we were kind of going for commercialization of our product. So we wanted someone who had the capabilities to provide us with a safety mark and to provide us with essentially the ability to go global with our product. But, you know, this was just a few months ago. We had a project that was basically on the 1 yard line. It needed an hour of work, but we fell out of their queue. And we just needed it done. And we couldn't get it done because it's a first in, first out queue, and there's just no way that that's their process. And so we had to wait 2 weeks from this test lab to give 1 hour of work so that we could get the report that we needed to push a design change through. So that was a bit frustrating. In our first gen incarnation, we used a test lab that was much more of it was almost like a mom and pop shop. But they were able to do everything. They weren't able to give us global certification, but they were able to get us what we needed to get through the FDA, which was all we needed at that time. And that worked out really great. Yeah.
Did you ask other people, or how did you find test labs that were appropriate for your style of product, or is it do what you want to do?
So I don't think that there's a magic answer to that, and I think that could also be another really good point for this discussion that we found is really take your time evaluating your options. Test labs make a boatload of money off of you. They want you. And so, you know, make sure you're taking your time, make sure you're evaluating the different options, make sure you're feeling good about what labs you're going to work with, and don't necessarily dive right in. And I'll also refer back to point number 1 of demystify it. If you know kind of your general requirements, or maybe you don't know them for sure, but maybe you have a hypothesis on what testing you need to get done, that'll also help you select an appropriate test lab. So the last point I have there is we've been served really well by using consultants. So if you just picture it, test labs are here. They're all about equipment and calibration and standards and regulations, which none of you guys really should be thinking about. You should be thinking about your product and users and adoption and business models. And so, of course, you need to understand kind of a bare minimum, a basic understanding of all of that. But that's where a consultant can come in really handy, is someone who's an intermediary between you and whatever the regulatory body is, or the test lab is, or whatever. So, for example, in our case, sterilization is really important. There's lots of standards around sterilization because it's a medical device, and so we had to meet certain requirements for sterilization. And so we're getting our ISO audit, and our auditor is a nice guy. But he's giving us our first audit, and if we don't get this, I mean, this is a requirement to be able to commercialize your medical device. So we're in the ISO audit, and he looks at our sterilization protocol, and he says, this is not compliant, this won't do. And so we're kind of, having a mini freak out inside, but we had a consultant who was based in Florida, very knowledgeable, very up to speed on the standards, and so we had her on call for the audit, just in case anything came up. So we phoned her up. Hey, we're here with the auditor. We're having some issues. Can you please, weigh in on this? And I must say, I had a huge grin I was trying to hide a huge grin after that because she ripped him real good, and he had his tail between his legs, which is a great place to have an auditor. But yeah, so we've been served really well using consultants. But again, to the earlier point, there's no magic, there's no yellow pages for who's the right consultant for you and for your business and for what your needs are. So, taking your time and finding the right person is really important there. And then I'll just loop back around to demystifying it one more time, because I think that's one of the key points here that I hope you take away. If you hire a consultant, don't hire the consultant to have all the knowledge about design for test safety and compliance. Someone internal to your organization, one of you guys, probably needs to have a basic understanding, and then you use the consultant to confirm your understanding or to validate what you're thinking, and then of course you should challenge your consultants too. That's really important. So that concludes the things that I think worked for us. So again, thank you so much for your time, and if there's any, I guess, I don't know if now is the time for questions or if we'll transition right to the panel, but thank you so much for your time and your attention.
So at this point, we're going to turn it over to Don. Andre's going to join the rest of our panel. Don Thompson, for those of you that don't know, I imagine a lot of you do, is the AC's product development mentor and also the most sarcastic person I've met in my life. So if he gets sassy on the panel, that's just how it's going to be. And if he yells at me immediately after this, that's also par for the course. And so if you have questions, I think we'll kind of get started for the first half or so. We'll just let them dive into it, and then we'll open it up for people to ask questions. But if you have anything sort of like pressing right away, don't hesitate to ask, and we'll pick you out. Okay? All right, great.
So I have a hot mic. Yeah. Good. So yes, thank you all for coming. I'm Don Thompson. I'm the mentor for product development at the AC. I recognize most of you, and for those of you I do not, welcome. What I want to do actually to start off the panel is just have everybody else introduce themselves, because they hadn't really had a chance. Just name, rank, what you do, and ultimately we'll get to questions. And if anybody in the audience has questions that they want to get into and talk about first, please feel free. I have a list of a bunch of questions. I also made some questions based on your talk, Andre, which is great. Thank you for that. But let's get going. So we'll start. You've already introduced yourself. You're up.
Hey guys, my name is Mike Brown. Is it on? Can you guys hear me? Yeah? There we go. My name is Mike Brown. I'm the Director of Business Development for Swift Labs. It's a local company that does testing, regulatory compliance management, and engineering services. So primarily we're a product development company, and whether that's in the certification sphere or the engineering sphere, we kind of do a whole bunch of different things.
Hello, I'm Scott Napper. I'm Director of Manufacturing and Supply Chain with Alert Labs. Prior to that, I was Director of Engineering Services with BlackBerry. So in that, I managed a team that built, distributed, supported all of BlackBerry's global manufacturing test systems. So the perspective I think I'm going to bring here is from a manufacturing test and probably more specifically the cost implications, cost mitigation strategies around that.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Ross Cruikshank. I'm with a company called Wistron, who are actually a Taiwanese company. So we have an office here in Canada. The reason we ended up here was Wistron used to do all the manufacturing latterly for BlackBerry. I worked in BlackBerry 15 years doing mostly MPI test development, and really have 30 years of building new products and bringing them to the market, mostly around the manufacturing supply chain. So questions around manufacturing test strategies, designing for test, fielded my way, and hopefully I can help. Thanks.
My name is Jim Daly. I work for Lucid. We are a regulatory compliance body that would help you certify your product so you can get into markets of your, where you'd like to sell your products around the world. And as special projects manager, I'm also looking at ways we can expand our facilities across Canada and provide services to manufacturers across the network.
Not used to be in the mayor's chair here. So a couple things, actually. I think just for everybody's knowledge, it'd be helpful if we just knew what some of the safety and certification nomenclature is. I think that's, I think I know some of it, but everybody else may have different implications of that. So Mike, why don't you, what are some of the safety certification stuff that you see from Swift Labs, and make sure people just have kind of a lexicon that they can go with?
Sure. So generally when I think about product safety or product certifications, I kind of split in a couple different areas. Our company focuses a lot on wireless technology, so even though that's kind of one part of a broad range, but if you look at product safety from a FCC perspective, there isn't too much beyond your product safety for like UL safety and stuff like that. We also do a lot of stuff like RF testing and EMC testing and individual product safeties across the globe for things like CE and things of that nature. So there's a lot of different kind of areas, and in order to put your product into one of those buckets, as Andre was kind of mentioning earlier, we do a lot of consulting to make sure that you get in the right bucket and then you start off on the right path. I think that's one of the most important things when considering product safety.
So building on that, one of the questions that consistently comes up is really what can be done in-house versus out-house, for lack of a better way to put it. So what I look at there is how do we keep our costs down? How do we do the minimum amount to get us to the right place? So I don't know, James, if you can share some of your experience there.
Sure. I think that when you're looking at your product and that you're planning to introduce to the market, there's a few things you should consider. One is looking at it at the design stage. If you are working with yourselves and not using a consultant, I think it's best to get an understanding, for instance, looking at North America, try and understand what CSA and UL standard that your product needs to comply with. So you can use a test house to maybe look at your design stage, maybe help identify what the applicable standard is, do construction reviews to make sure you're on the right path. That's basically covering safety of anything AC, POE type application, battery operated. The other thing that you should also consider looking at is, depending on where you want to go, if you're using a wireless device or any type of Bluetooth, you want to make sure that you want to look at the radio side of it and the EMC side, so obviously your FCC Industry Canada, to make sure whether it's working with the test lab to determine if it needs to be a registration or is it just a test report that's acceptable. And then when you look around other markets around the world, it's a whole new game. So it's best to really try to get an understanding where you want to put your market early in the design stage, so that way you can look at the standards that are different around the world. There are some harmonization, but there are a lot of differences. And best money spent is to do some upfront pre-scanning and some compliance work prior to full certification, because you may need to make changes.
No, thanks for that. I think we'll touch on that in a second, the pre-scan versus, keeping going, pre-scan versus final. So one of the things, though, that I want to ask Ross, is from the idea from a contract manufacturer. I know a lot of people are working with contract manufacturers at various stages, and some of the contract manufacturers sell doing certification testing and being involved in that process. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of what people should be expecting from contract manufacturers in that vein?
Yeah, so I'm fairly new to contract manufacturing, having been in BlackBerry and Motorola prior to that, so it's interesting. But most contract manufacturers today want to sell you more than just manufacturing services. They want to sell you design services. They want to be able to help you certify your product. So when you engage with a partner like Wistron, they'll try and marry a business model to you, right, that gives you the right mix, right? If you want a simple build-to-print strategy, just build this product and we'll consign the test solution. That's one approach. Another thing we do at Wistron is we will design the whole manufacturing process for the customer. So you bring the product to Wistron, they'll take a look at it and they'll design the SMT recipe, assembly tooling, the test development suite, everything. Another thing they'll do is they'll offer design services to you. So you may have a partially completed design. They can finish that design, or they may want to collaborate with you right at the beginning, and all you have is, I want to get to market with this product, and here's the features. And that's what they call joint development effort, JDM. So basically these offerings exist in, not just with Wistron, but most partners will offer. They're called EMS Plus services today.
Mm-hmm. And so, Scott, one of the things that certainly would be interesting to talk about as we kind of go through the life cycle of a product here, from an ongoing manufacturing perspective, what are some of the things that need to be considered to make sure that you're going to stay in compliance with your manufacturing process?
Yeah, sorry.
Mic on.
Yeah, certainly, I'm probably not the right person to answer this fully, but I know from BlackBerry, the production testing that we did was really based around that. So having limits set that make sure that you're always within a specific range to ensure that you are within compliance and that you haven't drifted throughout the process, certainly important.
Well, in terms of operationalizing testing, what are some of the thoughts in terms of what can be done to operationalize that testing? Is there anything they should be considering longer term?
I think from a design cycle, there's always, a whole boatload of testing that you want to do on your product to make sure, as Andre was saying, to get to market, and also make sure that your product is functioning correctly. On the compliance side, there's audits that will go on throughout the manufacturing cycle. And on the design side, there's all kinds of different things. So if you look at product reliability, for example, if your product has to be protected from a water ingress standpoint, so say you want to get IP68 or 67, or those are things that you always want to be testing during the design cycle as you're developing the product. And then once you're on the manufacturing side of things, those are things that you can kind of test, off the line. I'm going to pull 2 units randomly and say, oh, well, does my water ingress still work? And it also goes for all other areas of testing as well, whether that's, you're testing the RF values of the device or anything of that nature.
And so I'm wondering, Andre, because you've launched a successful product, of course, which everybody here wants to be doing. So just when I think of the budget required to do so, and just how you're allocating, some of the cash that was required during the development phase, what did that look like in terms of orders of magnitude?
That's a good question. So one of the things when we started off is we didn't really understand how to manage projects. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the project management triangle, but it's where you have, essentially what it's saying is you have X number of resources and you need to balance between money, speed, and features. So one example of a feature is global certification, compliance, whatever, so you can sell it throughout the world. So you can have that if you want it, but it's going to cost you time and money. And another example of a feature is a custom PCB or a custom injection molded enclosure versus something that's machined. You can have it, but it's going to cost you time and money. And so understanding those trade-offs at the very start is really important. It really wasn't until we started having realistic project management that we were actually able to make these calls. You might find yourself sitting there right now thinking, well, I don't have the right information to, there's so much information here, I don't even know how to make these calls. But once you start getting into actually managing the project, you'll be able to have information to make those calls. But to your question, I'll give an example. In medical, running a sterilization validation and a cleaning validation, which you need for surgical instruments, probably costs you about $50,000 Canadian. Running EMC scan, which is electromagnetic compatibility to make sure your RF device works properly with other devices, plays nice. Somewhere between 10 and 15 grand for us. I don't know. Jim might have better rates for you.
We have a discount with EAC. He's offering 10% off today.
Yeah, and then for example, one thing, our system runs off of a MacBook platform, and every time the MacBook changes, you're going to have to go back and do your rescan. So that's $15K again, and these costs tend to add up. So they're kind of in the tens of thousands of dollars per test kind of thing, if you want a rough order of magnitude.
And so thinking about that, and actually, Jim, I'd be curious, there's a lot of specialized equipment required for these tests, and so what, do you rent, do you buy, do you, Kickstarter and try to, go in with some friends? How do you do this?
Yeah, well, we actually will own all our test equipment. It has to go under a calibration program to ensure that the results that we obtain are within the requirements. If there's specific tests that we don't have equipment for, because it could be something really high power, something along those lines, yes, rentals come into play.
Well, what about for the startup themselves? And they want to do their own quick scans, and they want to, they don't want to necessarily contract out, but can they rent in equipment or?
Sure you can.
Yeah,
you can rent equipment, and you can run some of your own validation tests, so that way when you're going into a test lab, you're confident that your product is in compliance. However, in taking that, using that equipment, you need to make sure you know how to run it or have someone that knows how to run it, because that could mean the difference of a pass to you and a fail as part of the requirements of a standard.
Although if I would just jump in on that, I think young startups should not be thinking, go to guys like Jim and get it into their test labs, or avoid going there altogether by buying pre-certified components.
Yeah, so as you always talk about, you want some sort of horror story along those lines, but someone who's getting close to a prototype that they want to introduce to the market, and you, for instance, when you're looking at Canada, US, Europe, let's say, obviously you're looking at the safety side. As I mentioned before, you can kind of have a construction review, work with the engineering that knows the specific standards, and ensure that you're building your product properly to the requirements of the standards, such as creepage distances, wiring, make sure you're using the proper color coding, looking at the different type of power, making sure you're complying with the requirements for 50 hertz, 60 hertz, 120, 130 volt, 240, etc. And from an EMC standpoint, you can do pre-scans. Usually one of the most issues, as we talked about RF, is looking at, doing radiated emissions and immunity as one of the things, or electrostatic discharge. It's always important to get those things done ahead of time, because therefore you'll be able to come back, work with the engineer. They'll be able to help identify where there could be problem areas. They can make some suggestions. And one thing we'll, as a regulatory body, we can't tell you how to fix it, because it becomes a conflict of interest, especially if we go to certify an end product and it doesn't meet requirements, and it looks like, we're to blame because we told you how to do it. We'll help pinpoint the area, and you as the experts should know kind of what we can do. Or we refer you to possibly look at using a consultant who then can basically help you redesign if that's what it needs to do.
So changing gears a tiny bit, what I'm trying to, you mentioned horror story, and I want to spice it up. Okay. So I want to get a good horror story from somebody, anybody who wants to share something, and it has to end in fire. People should be harmed, not killed. But somebody, give us a horror story. Scott.
I can give you a certification horror story.
Not yet.
No?
I want to know a product that blew up. Scott, I know you've got one.
A product that blew up. Yeah, we did have some.
See, it was some BlackBerry stuff. I knew there was.
No, I actually, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind sharing a horror story related to manufacturing test and cost.
Let's do it.
And you're speaking about test equipment, renting versus owning. So, just to touch on that very quickly, my experience, I've rented a lot of equipment in my life, over my career, and purchased a lot of equipment. And typically, especially for startups, very low volume, the pricing you're going to pay for renting equipment is pretty steep. Typically, a test equipment vendor will amortize that equipment to you, over like a 1-year period. So if you have long-term rental needs, in the range of 12 months, you're probably better to look at actually purchasing that equipment.
What's a piece of equipment? What's an example of one of those?
A CMW 500, or it could be just a power supply, an Agilent power supply, or any of that type of gear, whether it's for compliance or for manufacturing. They're pretty steep and expensive. But related to the horror story, I kind of, and one thing to consider when you're designing your product, think about the cost implications to manufacturing tests. So by that I mean, enabling, if you've got multiple products that you're planning to bring out, enabling common test platforms across multiple product sets, that share common test points, share common instruments where possible, avoid designing in single-sourced vendors. I know it's really hard on some of the software development where instruments behave differently, so it's easy to kind of side with one that you really like, but it leads to my horror story, which happened at BlackBerry, where One particular test equipment vendor was very, very good at getting in with the hardware development teams, and they knew they were embedded pretty heavily with them, and those hardware development teams were actually planning on only developing on that platform, which put the supply chain side of manufacturing test in a very difficult position, where you're trying to negotiate with a supplier who knows that you only have a choice to go to them. So, you know, it's easy to forget about those things because hardware developers typically focus on, you know, the technical specifications of their product, but there are very expensive implications to some of the design choices that you make. So.
Yeah, it's hard enough to get one working, but when you start to get other vendors and manufacturers in there, but it's something to consider from a long-term viability perspective, for sure. Are there any questions from the audience so that I'm not talking so much? Are there? Go ahead.
So I've got a question for Andre. So our company is, like I said, working in pharma, but we're branching out and working in a medical device space as well. And the medical device is like a medical device because it's not a hard component. It's like an actual test or a diagnostic for, I guess, more applications. And so with this test, there's like no precedent. We don't really have any investment at this point. It's like a bootstrap. We are making money, but I know we're obviously a bit tight on, you know, where we want to spend our money. So the question really comes down to, like, I guess kind of two, what can you do, I guess, if you don't have money for consultants that, you know, can at least get you some legwork done for when you have money to look up for consultants? And as an alternative, like, what's like a kind of a minimum spend that you would say would be reasonable to actually extract some value to kind of progress yourself with consultants?
The second part of the question, which is what's the minimum spend with a consultant to extract value? My approach is, again, that first thing is demystify it. So go in with your own hypothesis and then use them to validate that. One of our board members, Chris Shaw from Baylis Medical, once told us when we were very, very early stage, never ask a consultant for anything that you don't already know the answer to. And so we kind of took that approach. And so, you know, if you have a consultant, they're, you know, consultants range between $200 and $200 an hour to $1,000 an hour kind of thing. And so I would say if you can, you know, you can get a lot of value for just, you know, maybe an hour or two a month kind of thing. You can definitely get a lot of value if you do the legwork yourself. So I guess that does tie into your previous question a little bit, that you know, if you have $1,000 a month that you can set aside for now while you're bootstrapping it, that could be your consulting budget. That might be okay.
What do others on the panel think about that? Just, you know, Swift Labs. What do you? Because you guys get called in at all different stages and what have you. So
Yeah, I mean,
and move a little bit closer there.
as a company that is a consulting company,
Sorry, it's Dirty Consulting Company, right? I think that's what I heard.
I think there's a lot of value in at least reaching out to consulting companies, right? I mean, if you get me on the phone, I'm not going to charge you to discuss certification or hardware engineering concepts, or, you know, maybe you've come to me with a design and you say, hey, you know, how much do you think this is going to be to build this CAD-M1 plus GPS module solution? You know, a lot of consulting firms have sales teams which are knowledgeable in these areas and can give you some good advice off the front. And then if you have further questions, you can go and get maybe 2 or 3 hours here or 5 hours, as Andre was saying. We do at Swift Labs consulting projects that range from $500, because it's, you know, a couple hours of work, to large scale product developments that are, you know, in the millions of dollars range. So I don't think that you should shy away from consulting. I think it's just a matter of understanding, like Andre said, what you're going to ask, and then hopefully they can verify, you know, some of your assumptions, and you can get away with a little bit more than you.
What are the thoughts just from a consulting perspective? Because it's something, calling in the experts is something, you know, I like the way Andre put it, is, you know enough and know what you don't know, essentially, to call somebody in. So what are your thoughts, Jim?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, as I said, working with the consultant up front, I think is very important as well, because they, you know, you're charging them to help you design the product so you can get it to where it needs to go. But another thing to think of, even from a consulting standpoint, and they should all know, is that when you are developing an end product, always ensure that the components you're using within the product are certified components, because you'll end up spending 50 times more money in the end run to get that product certified by using components that you possibly got cheaper somewhere else, and whether it be called, somewhere in Asia or wherever it may be. Always use a primary source component should always be certified.
Is it okay if I jump in and just make I really liked Mike's comment about the just calling up different people and technical salespeople, being knowledgeable. Sometimes I know I'm not going to go with a certain group, but just talking to people helps you validate your own hypotheses, and it helps you identify other areas that you might not be otherwise aware of. So I think that's a very excellent strategy, is, talk to technical salespeople and just get out there and just talk to a lot of people, and that's a good way to get free consulting.
Yeah, what I just took a note on is we should take advantage of Swift Labs. If you just want to talk, he's there for you, shoulder to cry on. Jumping. Are there any other questions? It certainly is. I'm not sure if anybody else has any questions. I've got a lot more here. So. I almost saw a hand go up. Okay. One of the things that I think it's worthwhile bringing up, we're done at 1:30, right? Okay, just looking at my time. So one of the things that, we're always making trade-offs as a startup is how do we spend, time, cost, or quality. And one of the things that could be traded off, whether it should be, I want to get your feedback on, is whether or not we actually have to do certified testing. So I'm kind of curious, what's the impact of actually not being certified for a product? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take it.
Give it.
Generally, when you don't certify, let's use North America as an example, and you don't certify a product, so a couple things. One, you have your authority having jurisdiction, your code representative in that particular province or state may stop your product from being allowed to be hooked up or turned on. But if it does get passed through regulatory or wherever, and the product does go into either a commercial or residential market, and the product catches fire or shock hazards or whatever it may be, and there was no certification on it, the homeowner's risking the fact that they wouldn't be covered for liability for insurance. The manufacturer or the person that sold them that device could be putting themselves in a real legal situation, especially if someone got hurt or something burned down. So there are quite a bit of consequences in regards to not making sure you comply with regulatory compliance.
So if it squeaks through the border, still causes an issue,
You're still the manufacturer, you're still responsible.
Absolutely. What's the liability from a contract manufacturer's perspective in that whole engagement? Is there anything that, a startup could strong arm a CM and have them ship them uncertified, or?
No, I'm not aware of anything like that.
No?
But I know for some of the IoT products that are UL, that need UL, there's a requirement within manufacturing to capture that data, right? You do, in some products, what we call high pot testing, right? And high pot testing, you need to have data that shows that every unit went through high pot testing.
Just to add to that, in ensuring from the compliance standpoint, so what ends up happening after a product is certified in North America is that there's what they call surveillance audits. The regulatory body that approved your product will show up at your manufacturing location, whether it's locally or whether it's in another country, will show up at that factory unannounced to ensure that the product that we certified is exactly the way the product is still being built and you're using all the same components. Because a certification body, if that product was found to be doing something different, we have the power to shut you down production.
Yes, I know one of the other questions that was going to come up was around, once you're certified, right, is it all hands off, right? And the reality is no, right? Supply chain variation and manufacturing process variation can put your conforming product very quickly, into a non-conforming situation, right? So that's where you have to periodically be, doing your own audits, also know the weaknesses in your own product, right? How much did you have margin on the critical to quality parameters, right? So when you went through cert, did you have 6 dBs margin on, TRP or whatever, right? Did you have only half a dB on sensitivity on a specific channel? Thereafter, you need to keep close eye on those weak areas of your product to make sure you can stay in compliance, right? And one way to do that is audit testing, but also you can propagate that sensitivity down to manufacturing and put some tight limits on certain areas that you're sensitive about.
That sounds like a lot of work. I can't just fly with a radar as a startup.
I think it's important to have a quality management plan.
What is a quality management plan?
I think it kind of goes with what Ross was saying. I mean, if you have, there are, as you were saying, a lot of different variations. I think cellular, in TRP and TIS and cellular is a little bit more complicated than maybe doing modular Bluetooth design. But knowing exactly where you're right at the edge of what is a failure and what's not a failure is important. And you'll get a lot of that data when you do your regulatory certs. So you should have a pretty good idea, but it's always worthwhile to check things as you go through the production.
And it's probably, yeah.
If you're using a pre-certified module in one of your products, what is your responsibility as the end user of that pre-certified module if you notice it's going out of compliance somehow? Do you have to, is it your responsibility to report that to the manufacturer? Or how far as an end user are you required to go?
As the end user, it's the manufacturer's responsibility. So when I say the end user, I mean you are responsible. Most of when you do a pre-certified module in any kind of circumstance, it's pre-certified in a specific way. So when you take that and then you integrate it into your own product, that becomes your product. And you're responsible for ensuring that it adheres to all these different standards globally.
But how is that even possible, given that you're buying that pre-certified module on the basis that that module, the manufacturer of the module, has gone through a certain amount of testing in order to get at that point, and if that module, they make a change to the module or component or whatever, and it is no longer compliant with the original testing that they did, then how is it my responsibility as the end user to notice that or even test for it?
So if a module provider changes their revision of the module and you're using one of the older revisions, your older revision is presumably still compliant to the original RF certification that occurred. As the end product user, you're responsible for all the EMC related testing, right? So if they change it and it's no longer valid from the original module certification, then that would be on the module provider, and they'd have to be telling all of their customers that their module is no longer certified for, the appropriate areas.
One of the other things that a certification body does is that when you are looking at components within a product, we verify that they are certified. So we will follow up on the actual listing of that product. If that product is found during the test not to be compliant, we as the certification body would probably tell you that you may want to consider looking at a new component, but from that component manufacturer standpoint, probably somewhere along the line, the certification body that did that product is doing some sort of surveillance audit or validating their quality test checks that they were doing on the production line. But from an EMC radio standpoint, I think that, sometimes it's mandatory after, I think, 2-3 years for FCC or something like that on a radio to do a requalification. Somewhere along the line, I mean, you as the end product manufacturer are still responsible for the end product. It's you running into a problem with that component. You just might want to change it or notify the manufacturer.
Okay. Ryan.
Just wondering if somebody could maybe touch on, beta testing and getting your products out early, probably before you've done all of the testing, just some of the risks or some of the ways you can maybe use those.
Yeah, we absolutely, like what's required, we preach all the time to the guys to get product out early, get feedback from customers, et cetera. What are the requirements for, the 5 units I send out, the 50 units I send out?
I mean, I could start with that.
Sure, start and take the question.
For Canada, if you're looking at trying to launch a product in Canada before doing an end certification, or you have a limited quantity of product you want to certify, if it's a medical device, there's a new standard that came out about a year and a bit ago. It's called SPE 3000. It's a special inspection standard that allows us to look at the requirements as per the Canadian Electrical Code to make sure that we're covering shock fire hazard. And then if it's a non-medical device, it's called SPE 1000. Again, same concept, it's about the Canadian Electrical Code. Now, the other thing is it's 500 units maximum in a year of any particular model type, and it depends on what province you're selling them in, that each province has a requirement based on the size of the province.
Now, is that SPE 3000 for all medical devices, including class 1?
No. I don't know off the top of my head, but you'd have to look through the standard. At the back of the standard, there will be products that would be not applicable to SPE 3000, such as MRI machine, as an example. And then if you're looking at trying to launch to go into the U.S. as a market, you might as well certify the product, because they don't have a special inspection type standard that we do. Actually, the product is tested to the actual end standard.
I would also ask yourself, as leaders in early stage startups, you guys are risk managers, so you have a risk budget that you're trying to spend wisely. And I would ask yourselves, do I need to have any certification or certification done? What's the risk? And just thinking it through logically can be really helpful. If we want to be successful, if we want to get stuff into the hands of users, we're going to have to take risks, and sometimes that means we don't have all of the appropriate certifications and the appropriate compliance in place. I think you just need to have an open mind and evaluate things kind of, what makes sense for your particular circumstances.
Yes, I noticed that you guys are very knowledgeable overall on all the subject matter that you touched on. One thing that I did just think about is that maybe a lot of people may not be aware of is consideration for row house versus non-row-house materials and material compatibility grades and the impact that it can have for substitutions on certifications. And maybe James, maybe you may comment on it, or someone else.
Yeah, unfortunately, as Tiff said, we chose not to get into the ROSE compliance or REACH or WE for looking at international markets, but it's basically how, as an example under ROHAS, it's the process that you have for the electrical material or for the components that you have, for instance, the computers or whatever it may be, to ensure that you're complying with the requirements of lead content and how you dispose of the product and things along those lines. There are agencies out there that do the environmental type application to it. Unfortunately, we don't offer that service.
It's almost, I wouldn't even consider these days not being ROS compliant, honestly, right? I think it's just a path to failure.
Yeah.
So yeah, take it very seriously that everything's lead free. And also look at conflict minerals in your product, right? Do you have any conflict minerals like tantalum? That there's ethical questions around usage, because a lot of organizations, once you scale, won't touch products that's got conflict minerals in them, right? So that's an important area to look at also.
I think ROHS too has, like Ross was saying, I think most manufacturers of any type of electronics components now, they kind of just standardize on ROHS. But if you are looking to get specific type of materials that may not have that standard already built into, there are test labs out there that you can actually get to do specific XRF scanning and things of that nature so you can get it done. But a lot of this goes back to who is asking for that standard to be done and what is the I guess, certification requirements around it. ROHS is a standard that is required, actually ROHS 2 now, in Europe, but a lot of that gets put on the manufacturer, so whoever's building that product needs to ensure that their product is ROHS compliant. So how you manage to do that, whether that's a supply chain exercise where you know and you believe that all of your components are sourced appropriately, and then also on the contract manufacturing side, if it's built to ROHS standards and they've kept it all similar, or they've kept all of your components in a specific line that is ROHS compliant. A lot of that has to do with supply chain as well. But if you do need to get it tested, you can get it tested as well.
Question, go ahead.
So touching on what Andre was saying about risk assessment, do you guys have any examples of non-compliance prohibiting or inhibiting the company from going to market?
This sounds like a potential horror story opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, most companies actually fail some sort of thing within their final certification cycle. As a product development company, we always suggest that you do pre-scans for the key areas that we think that you'll fail. So if you're doing a Bluetooth product and you're doing a chip-down solution, so you have to do all the RF testing, we'll create a suite of testing for you to say, look, you should be doing your EMC. Are you going to Europe? Okay, well, you don't have immunity if you're just doing North America. So our test suite for the North American version of this product is RF band edges and all the EMC types of testing. But there are clients that fail regulatory certification, and that's just kind of a fact, and then you just have to really deal with that. A lot of what we do is try and read the standards before you start developing the product, or get the standard before you start developing the product, or at least midway. It's never too late to go get a standard and try and understand whether your design is impacted by, some of the methodologies that they use to assess it.
So quick follow-up on that. Just what tools are available so people can learn more about this? Like, are there any, Wikipedia your place to go, or?
There isn't a lot of good tools, I don't think. I mean, you can go to the websites of, standards companies, and you go to Usud and whatever. I think the main thing is to go talk to an expert on it, whether that's, Swift Labs, who can give you this information as you kind of...
For free?
For free, absolutely.
No obligation.
But I think if I'm a design engineer looking to build a product and you're unsure of what standards are required for your product, having an expert who knows all of those different areas is really where you want to go, in my opinion. Swift Labs kind of offers a regulatory and compliance manager service, and you can use that service to make sure that your product is getting compliant to the right standards globally, or if it's just North America, or wherever you need to go. So.
Cool. You have a question?
I have a somewhat related question.
Okay.
Buying the ISO standards can be expensive. Has the Accelerator Center or anyone considered having a library open to the public or members where people could go read them? Or does anybody like the university have a library?
Well, the good news is the CFO of the Accelerator Center is here today. And he brought his wallet. It's a great question. Are there any services that are around for those types of things that anybody's aware of?
Like the FDA has online requirements, so you can go read them, talk about them, understand them, but then you have to spend a fair amount of money if you're going to get the official ISO standards.
I think it's about $300 for the ISO.
But then that's like the basic, and then there's many hardware standards. So.
Yeah, it's tough to get every single standard and purchasing them all. I mean, a lot of products, you have to get the safety standard, and then you have to get the RF standard, and you have to get the EMC standard, and then if that's just North America. If you got to go to Europe, then you got to go get the ESD standard and the immunity standard, and in Europe they do a lot of different types of product testing for outdoor requirements, and where's your classification of the product? Is it a medical product? Is it it's kind of an endless rabbit hole of how many standards you really want to buy. And I think that's kind of part of the thing of going back to consulting and getting someone who knows these types of things can give you some really good information on what you should be looking at.
So that doesn't come free.
I think I just gave her some pretty good information.
You did. You did. I'll give you that. Are there any other questions? Okay. So one of the things that I'm curious about, because the goal here isn't just to develop my first product, it's to develop follow-on products and V2s and what have you. So how do we account for, impacts of just product lifecycle changes based on, for testing, certification, compliance, et cetera? Anybody want to take that? I can answer it if you really want, but I don't want to.
Well, I'll start. So, let's say you had an initial product and you certified it, and you've come up with either a secondary product as part of the family, or you've made modifications to the initial product. You have to, you should be reaching out to the test lab that did your initial testing to talk about, what are the changes that were made. They may ask, okay, so are they cosmetic? Are they hardware? Is it component related? Did you actually reconfigure the entire product? You've moved the board. So therefore, they'll have, the testing lab will identify as part of the standards, what tests should be completed, whether it's considered a new product period, or it is just an update and a modification to your existing product. And just, as I said, run some verification tests. Generally, most times, EMC is always one of those ones that you're going to do over no matter what you do, because you are making changes that could impact positioning where your I/O lines are, or some type of wireless, or some type of longer cable that you've put in there that could emit noise, or whatever it may be. So, but we would work with you to help identify what needs to be done. If they came to you and said that they had to certify the product right from start again, then it would have to be a real significant change to that product that really changed what the entire product does.
Yeah, complete board spin versus a component change.
Exactly.
Right.
And as I said, one of the other things you should always consider too is if you're looking at certifying a product, when you're looking at components, if there are alternate components you can use, just as we talked about supplier chain, work with the test lab and say, hey, you know what, I've got 2 or 3 different alternate components that we could use for this product. From a safety standpoint, it's pretty straightforward as long as they have the same type of ratings and the same end result of what it is that that component's going to do. EMC, they may be able just to do some pre-scans to see if the results kind of come in with where you're in line with, but we can list all those components at once. So when a factory audit takes place, we are looking for either one of those components for use within that product to allow you to continue manufacturing.
On the approved bill of material, what have you.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes left, and I have yet to hear any examples of fire. So I know, Ross, you had one. I know you got one. If you gave, again, BlackBerry, Motorola, gotta be something.
I have one. I have many horror stories, but I was actually, as I was driving here, trying to think how many were product related, right? And not too many, right? And one of the neat things we used to have at BlackBerry was we used to fix a lot of hardware problems with software. Right? You'd be amazed how many hardware fixes, hardware issues you could solve with software, right? So we used to build basically a device, and then later it would get configured with its final software for the customer, right? And that final software load was actually only ever meant to do final software load. But that last stage was always a catch-all for fixing things, right? And that test stage grew, right, over and over again. It would tweak this and tweak that and make an adjustment here, right? To, it was a real dive and catch test stage, right? But it really saved us in many ways. But we did have I think it was one of our first UMTS products. We were very keen to get it launched. We'd stuffed the market, the channel full of product. Within weeks of ramping, right, we were alerted to a problem with, we had a spurious emissions issue, right, which is not a manufacturing test. It's really a cert test.
It's not your fault.
It's not our fault.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure.
Right. So sure enough, we took some samples straight off production, and we were failing it internally. We did the tests, and we couldn't even find a unit that had good margin, right? So we couldn't figure, how we'd sail through, right, cert, right? So I needless to say, this was painful. We had to halt for many weeks, do a hardware change, and go back through the whole process again. But that was a horror story, right?
The cost of that would have been huge.
Yeah, the cost was huge. We did spin our wheels for many weeks until we could recover that situation. And it's worse when you have, the bigger the company you are and the bigger dependency your customers are on you getting product to them. It becomes an even bigger heartache, right?
Right.
So I guess the lesson learned there is really, make sure you got that margin, right, that you think you have, right? Because I don't think we ever really got to root cause of what kicked it over, right?
Well, BlackBerry was in a unique position that they had their own manufacturing facilities.
Yeah.
Nobody here has their own manufacturing facilities, and so, you know, Wistron or other CMs are more than willing to take those units apart and charge you on a per unit basis and rework everything for a cost, right? And so quickly it ramps up and is going to get there.
Yeah, so things will change, right? Your product will not be the same product a month after ramp that you ramped with, right? And you mentioned alternative components, right? But almost every customer we engage with, they're quickly having to look at second source, right? Before they know it, you know, that key component that they loved, right, is last time buy, right? And you know, they're scrambling to get something that's the same footprint or meets exactly the same requirements, right? So that's the reality that we live in, right?
So, closing thoughts. Why don't each give one tidbit you want people to walk away with? One thing you wanted them to learn. Andre, you start.
Yeah, just obviously I had an advantage because I could give 20 minutes of what I want you to learn. But
just one thing.
Just one thing is that as everyone's talking up here, I'm just thinking, you're running a project, you have no money, it costs a lot to make a product. You're basically out of money by the time your product is ready because you're startups, you have no money, you've used it all. And it's at that time that your issues are going to surface. So you need to manage your risk because you don't want to have no money and have a compliance issue, have an EMC issue. EMC is like black magic. No one knows how to fix it. And
ESD too.
ESD too, yeah. So you need to be good managers of your risk.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Managing risk is, you know, basically a core part of doing product development. And whether that's testing risk, which can be kind of mitigated depending on your volumes and things like that. But on the certification side, there's a kind of a hard stop. You either get through or you don't. So I tell all of our clients that they should be doing pre-scans at least before their last board spin. I think that's a really good way of thinking about, you know, if you have an issue when you go to your final certification, you're going to have to do a board spin or a product spin of some description. And if that's 3 months down the line, then you're 3 months late. So I think planning ahead of time and ensuring that you have the right information to make good decisions is really the way that you kind of get through the certification process.
Cool. Scott?
Yeah, my mic's not working here, so I'll just talk loud. Sorry? Oh. Okay, I can usually talk louder. I would recommend that, you know, when you're designing your product, you think about scalability. You may be designing one product right now and, you know, maybe even small volumes over the next 12 months, but hopefully if you're successful, you know, those volumes will come. So things have a natural habit of progressing from the prototype stage into a high volume manufacturing environment. So making sure that you're designing with the thought to what happens when we're shipping 1 million units a month, you know, can go a long way to helping you mitigate some of those horror stories down the road.
That's the more money, more problem advice?
And from my perspective, I would just say to the audience, a lot of it's common sense, right? There's a tool we use often in manufacturing, failure modes effects analysis, right? Basically, you know, predict what can go wrong, right? And have a mitigation strategy for it, right? And use stats, right? Use a lot of stats in your judgments, right? Don't make decisions based on 2 or 3 units that you built on the bench, right? You really have to look at things, you know, a good statistical sample, right? Nothing less than 60, I would say, is a good sample. You know, and, you know, don't over-test in manufacturing. That's another common mistake. You know, put the effort into design validation testing, get through the lab cert, understand your product weaknesses, but don't over-test in manufacturing. It's not necessary. There's a lot of money wasted in manufacturing testing that doesn't add anything to the outgoing quality, right? And when you're using system-on-chip modules, for example, don't retest what the system-on-chip vendor's already testing, right? You can much simplify your manufacturing process that way.
The one comment I'll make is that there are many test labs around the world. There's hundreds of them. And when you are looking to certify a product, especially on the safety side, you want to make sure you work with a lab, A, that can get you globally where you want to go with your product and has the capabilities to provide that service to you, and 2, make sure the lab is accredited, such as Standards Council of Canada, OSHA, A2LA, other certification accreditations required around the world. So make sure you find that lab that has that and can get you where you want to go.
With that, I call the meeting to a close.
Don really wanted a story about fire. I would just like to say one more thing, because Ross kind of mentioned common sense to a lot of these aspects. Twice at 44 Gawkel now we've had fire scares. Both have involved soldering irons. One was a soldering iron was left on top of the lithium-ion battery for about 45 minutes. And the second one was a soldering iron or something very similar was left on top of a plastic component. So both the times the building was in fear of blowing up and or catching on fire. And the second time it smelled like burnt plastic for about 48 hours or so. So I guess the last thing, because I have no expertise in any of this, but be careful who you trust the soldering irons with, and also be very, very careful on who you hire for a co-op term. One, I'd just like to really, really thank our panel. Can we get one more round of applause for them? They were amazing. And a big thank to Don Thompson for moderating spectacularly. So panelists, we brought some gifts for you, which includes some swag as well as some delicious chocolates. And then I just want to give a big thanks for everybody coming out. This is our first time doing this. I know the weather was crummy, and there was some confusion about location, but we really, really enjoyed it, and we hope you got something out of it. So we're going to be doing this for 3 more weeks. Next week, we're doing Design for Manufacturing, Assembly, and Cost, and the keynote speaker is going to be Curtis McBride from Myovision, another one of our grads. So we hope to see you next week, same place, same time, and yeah, have a great day.